This video explores the dose-response relationship between physical activity and health outcomes. Many people may wonder how to use physical activity to improve their health or performance. How much activity is enough? What's the minimum I can do to stay healthy? How fit do I need to be to prevent a specific disease? To address these questions, exercise scientists and practitioners have worked to determine the characteristics of physical activity, such as type, intensity, frequency, and duration, required to bring about meaningful improvements in health and performance outcomes. Dose refers to the characteristics of physical activity, including type, intensity, frequency, duration, and amount. In other words, how much physical activity is needed to improve health or performance. Response refers to the various changes that occur in the body when a specific dose of activity is performed. When it comes to physical fitness and health, dose response is the relationship between fitness levels, measured by metrics like MET capacity on a treadmill or 1 repetition maximum on a bench press, and specific health outcomes, such as the risk of developing coronary heart disease. The aim of studying the dose-response relationship between physical activity and health is to determine the effective but not excessive amount of activity needed to achieve desired health outcomes. This helps public health authorities provide safe and cost-effective recommendations to the public. If recommendations for physical activity are set too high, it can make programs more expensive to design and implement. There are different types of dose-response relationships. They can be linear, nonlinear, or take the shape of an inverted U or U curve. We'll look at a few examples to illustrate these different patterns of dose-response relationships. For the figure on the right, the relation was nonlinear. The slope is steep at lower levels of physical activity, meaning you gain more health benefits with small increases in activity at the lower end, the lower level of physical activity. However, as you move to higher levels of activity, the slope flattens, indicating diminishing returns with further increases. In the 2018 Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee Scientific Report, each chapter explores 3 to 4 key questions. Under nearly every main question, there is a sub-question focused on dose response. The committee's goal is to determine the optimal amount of physical activity to recommend for different populations and individuals with varying health conditions. To better understand dose response issues, it's helpful to familiarize yourself with several key exercise training principles: overload, progression, and specificity. Overload occurs when a tissue, organ, or system is stressed by an increase in physical activity, which typically leads to an improvement in its capacity or efficiency. However, for overload to produce health benefits rather than injury, it needs to be applied gradually in small increments through a process called progression. If the overload is increased too quickly, it can lead to strain or injury, resulting in negative health outcomes. For example, individuals who have been very inactive should begin by walking at progressively faster speeds over weeks or months rather than immediately starting a jogging program. Once a person has reached an appropriate fitness goal, progression doesn't need to continue. Specificity refers to the concept that the type of physical activity determines the specific adaptations or changes in the body. A common example of specificity is prescribing resistance exercises to increase muscle size and strength, or endurance exercises to improve the body's oxygen transport and utilization systems. A clear illustration of specificity is seen in professional tennis players, where the dominant arm experiences greater muscle and bone mass increases, compared to the non-dominant arm, which is used less. The repeated use of the dominant arm to hit thousands of tennis balls results in adaptations that do not transfer to the non-dominant arm. Therefore, when describing the response to a given dose of activity, it's essential to clearly define the type of activity. When considering the intensity component of an activity's dose, it is important to differentiate between relative and absolute intensity. Relative intensity accounts for the exercise capacity of the individual, while absolute intensity refers only to the demands of the activity itself. This figure illustrates how relative intensity varies for individuals with different levels of fitness. For example, walking at 3 miles per hour represents a relative intensity of 24%, for a highly fit individual with a 14 MET capacity, making it a light intensity activity. However, for someone with a 4 MET capacity, walking at the same speed represents a relative intensity of 83%, making it a high intensity activity for that less fit individual. In most experimental studies, especially in epidemiology, intensity is expressed as relative intensity. However, in large prospective cohort studies, intensity is typically expressed in absolute terms without adjustment for individual exercise capacity. This is a screenshot of the Physical Activity Compendium website. It lists hundreds of activities and their associated MET values, which are based on absolute intensity. The compendium includes physical activities related to leisure, transportation, household tasks, and occupations. These MET values are fixed as long as the activity's speed or condition is defined, and they do not take into account individual fitness levels. The differences between methodologies relative vs. absolute intensity can complicate direct comparisons of dose-response data. This figure shows the relationship between all-cause mortality reduction in the y-axis and aerobic physical activity in the x-axis in a large study of 416,175 individuals from Taiwan. The authors observed that the mortality reduction was the same for running 5 minutes as for walking 15 minutes. For a 35% reduction in all-cause mortality, you could either run for 25 minutes or walk for 105 minutes. In other words, you need to spend about a quarter of the time running compared to walking to achieve the same health benefit. When discussing duration and frequency as components of the physical activity dose, it's helpful to review the historical recommendations for physical activity. As you go down the list, what changes do you notice? Earlier recommendations for PA typically provided specific guidance, such as engaging in 20 minutes of vigorous physical activity at least 3 times per week. To achieve this, the general public needed to set aside time specifically for exercise. However, more recent recommendations shifted focus to incorporating more activity into daily life, the lifestyle approach. This approach emphasizes accumulating physical activity throughout the day, recommending at least 30 minutes of moderate activity on 5 or more days of the week. When sedentary individuals begin increasing their activity levels, even small amounts of moderate to vigorous physical activity have been shown to improve both aerobic capacity and strength. More empirical studies support the concept that the greater the total amount of exercise, the greater the improvement in health outcomes. Especially the total amount of exercise equals to duration multiplied by frequency multiplied by intensity. However, the intensity must reach at least a moderate level. Current guidelines focus on prescribing the total amount of PA, regardless of how it is accumulated throughout the day or week. Which component of physical activity duration, frequency, or intensity matters most for health benefits? One of the few studies to directly compare all these components examined running characteristics such as duration, distance, frequency, total amount, and speed, and their association with all-cause and cardiovascular mortality in 55,137 adults. In this study, runners had a 30% lower risk of all-cause mortality and a 45% lower risk of cardiovascular mortality compared to non-runners. In the dose-response analysis, the health benefits were similar across different quintiles of running time, distance, frequency, total amount, and speed. Interestingly, even modest amounts of running less than 51 minutes per week, less than 6 miles, 1 to 2 times per week, or running at less than 6 mph were associated with a reduction in mortality risk compared to not running at all. However, at the higher end of running, regardless of which characteristic was measured, the hazard ratio increased slightly, suggesting diminishing returns. Now let's consider the key factors when determining the optimal activity dose for yourself, a client, or a patient. What type of activity pattern should be promoted if the minimal volume requirement is met? This figure shows 4 different exercise profiles, each providing a total of 720 MET minutes of exercise per week. The patterns vary widely. For instance, one option could be 6 sessions per week, each 30 minutes long at 4 MET minutes. Another could be 2 sessions per week, each lasting 120 minutes at 3 MET minutes. A more intermittent pattern could involve 18 sessions per week, each 10 minutes long at 4 MET minutes. Finally, there's the option of 3 sessions per week, each lasting 1 hour at 4 MET minutes. If the health benefits are similar across these patterns, this variety allows for flexibility in how individuals can achieve an adequate volume of activity to maintain or improve their health. Several unresolved dose-response research questions remain, particularly regarding the combination of duration and frequency. For example, how short can a bout of endurance exercise be while still contributing to specific health outcomes? Would stair climbing for 1 minute 20 times per day provide the same benefits as a single 20-minute session? Or do longer sessions like 75 minutes on 2 days per week offer the same health benefits as shorter, more frequent sessions such as 30 minutes 5 days per week? This data comes from the Harvard Alumni Health Study, a prospective cohort study we've discussed before. The study includes data from 8,421 men with a mean age of 66 years without major chronic diseases who provided details about their physical activity through mailed questionnaires in 1988 and 1993. Physical activity patterns were defined as follows. Sedentary, men expending less than 500 kcal per week in activities like walking, climbing stairs, and sports or recreation. Sufficiently active, men expending 500 to 999 kcal per week in these activities. Weekend warrior, men expending 1000 kcal per week or more through sports or recreation, but only 1 to 2 times per week. Regularly active, men expending 1000 kcal per week or more through activities like walking, climbing stairs, and sports recreation spread throughout the week. The study examined the relative risks of mortality based on physical activity patterns among two groups, low-risk men and high-risk men. Low-risk men had none of the following risk factors at baseline: cigarette smoking, overweight, history of hypertension, or hypercholesterolemia. High-risk men had at least one of these risk factors. What are the main findings for the low-risk and high-risk groups? The sedentary group served as the reference group in both cases. For the low-risk group, who had the lowest mortality risk, it was the weekend warriors who showed the lowest risk. Interestingly, the regularly active and insufficiently active groups had similar mortality risks. This data suggests that for low-risk individuals, a longer but less frequent pattern of activity, which is called the weekend warrior approach, provides the most health benefits. For the high-risk group, who had the lowest mortality risk, it was the regularly active group. Weekend warriors in this group showed a mortality risk similar to that of the sedentary group, while the insufficiently active group had a lower risk. This indicates that for high-risk individuals, shorter but more frequent bouts of activity provide the most health benefits. The researchers also aim to address the question of the minimal versus maximal dose of physical activity. A common question is, what's the minimum amount or intensity of physical activity needed to achieve significant health benefits? The answer depends heavily on a person's current activity level. For instance, someone who has been bedridden can experience substantial benefits simply by sitting upright or standing and moving slowly for a few minutes several times a day. At the high end of the PA dose, there is still limited data on the point at which further increases in physical activity no longer provide additional health benefits. For some, the required amount of activity appears to be quite high. One dose-response study showed that male runners continued to gain health benefits up to running 50 miles per week. Somewhere between the minimal and maximal doses of physical activity lies the optimal dose, the amount of activity that provides the greatest net health benefits with the least time and effort. The goal of current PA guidelines is to recommend this optimal dose. More data is needed to better understand the relationship between physical activity dose and specific health outcomes. Future research will depend on accurate measurements of physical activity and the resulting changes in health. Personalization is also critical when determining the right dose of physical activity for individual health improvements. As reflected in the second version of the physical activity guidelines, there are more chapters and recommendations for special populations, including older adults, women during pregnancy and the postpartum period, and people with chronic health conditions or disabilities, such as those with osteoarthritis, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and cancer survivors. To improve bone health, running is more effective. To prevent weight gain, total energy expenditure is crucial. To increase aerobic capacity, intensity plays a key role. What is the current evidence regarding the dose-response relationship between physical activity and different health outcomes? Let's start with the odds of maintaining a healthy weight at different levels of physical activity. Interestingly, the trend here is not linear. The odds of maintaining a healthy weight don't vary much between those doing 0.7 to 8.3 met hours of physical activity and those doing 8.3-16.7 met hours. In fact, the odds are the same for someone doing just 1 met hour of physical activity as for someone doing 16 met hours. This suggests that the way the authors created these 4 physical activity groups might not accurately reflect the relationship. Next, let's look at the incidence of hypertension in relation to leisure time physical activity. Here we see a perfect linear relationship with higher levels of PA associated with lower rates of hypertension. Now, consider the relationship between moderate to vigorous physical activity and the risk of type 2 diabetes. The relationship is curvilinear, meaning that increasing physical activity from low levels significantly reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes, but as PA levels rise, the reduction in risk becomes less pronounced. Acute and chronic training responses refer to the body's immediate and long-term adaptations to physical exercise. After a single exercise session, there is a significant and temporary decrease in blood pressure, which can last between 8 to 12 hours. This phenomenon is known as post-exercise hypotension and is common after moderate to intense exercise. It can be especially beneficial for people with high blood pressure, as regular exercise can help reduce resting blood pressure. However, this effect is not permanent. Once this period passes, blood pressure may return to its baseline levels unless exercise is maintained regularly. With consistent exercise over time, the body undergoes chronic adaptations, including improved cardiovascular health, enhanced muscle function, and long-term reductions in blood pressure and other cardiovascular risk factors. The acute changes seen in a single session, such as hypotension, can become part of a broader improvement in health when exercise is maintained consistently over weeks, months, and years. When prescribing or planning an exercise regimen, it is crucial to balance the health benefits of physical activity with potential risks. The key is to find a balance where individuals receive the maximum health benefits of exercise without overexerting themselves to the point of harm. For some people, this may mean moderate exercise with sufficient recovery time. Others may be able to handle higher intensities. Personalization is important in this assessment to tailor exercise doses based on an individual's health status, goals, and risk profile. Finally, let's examine a U-shaped relationship between MVPA and mortality. In this study, increasing physical activity from 0 to 40 to 75 met hours per week continuously reduces mortality risk. However, when physical activity exceeds 75 met hours per week, the mortality risk starts to rise again, indicating that excessive physical activity may offset the benefits. In the previous discussion, we explored whether physical activity or fitness is more important for health. Now let's examine the evidence. Here's a recent study, and interestingly, the first author is a colleague of mine who completed his PhD 3 years before I did. You may have read this paper. Was it an observational study or a randomized controlled trial? It was an observational study with no intervention. Was it a cohort or a cross-sectional study? It was cross-sectional because it used data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which doesn't follow the same group of participants over time, but rather uses multiple cycles of data. The study included data from 4,840 adults aged 40 and older, as younger people typically have lower mortality rates. The researchers used 7 days of accelerometer data to measure PA, providing more accurate data than self-reports. They measured step counts and step intensity, steps per minute, to determine activity intensity. The primary outcome was all-cause mortality, with cardiovascular disease and cancer mortality as secondary outcomes. The results showed a nonlinear relationship between total steps and mortality rate. Taking 2,000 steps per day was associated with significantly higher mortality compared to the reference group, those taking 4,000 steps per day. Mortality risk decreased as steps increased up to 12,000 per day, but there was no additional benefit beyond 12,000 steps. How does this relationship vary by age and gender? In the gender figure, both men and women benefit similarly when increasing steps from 2,000 to around 6,000 per day. However, men continue to see benefits with more steps beyond 12,000, while women see very limited additional benefits after reaching 8,000 steps per day. I'll ask you to interpret the age figure yourself. What about the effects of walking on cardiovascular disease and cancer? Both show nonlinear relationships with walking, but the patterns differ. For cardiovascular disease, the graph resembles the all-cause mortality figure. Significant benefits are gained by increasing activity from very sedentary levels. But the rate of improvement slows down as activity increases, with no further benefits beyond 12,000 steps per day. For cancer, the slope is much less steep, meaning that walking is less effective in preventing cancer than cardiovascular disease, but still helpful for reducing cancer mortality. How about fitness? What's the dose-response relation between fitness and health outcome? Does it have a similar relationship as physical activity? This next figure includes data from 6 different studies, 3 focus on PA and 3 on fitness. Although the original studies classified PA and fitness into different levels, including PA in tertiles, quintiles, or categories of energy expenditure, the authors standardized the horizontal axis as an approximate percentile ranking for direct comparison. Compare the calculated benefits of fitness vs. physical activity. The 3 PA studies at the top show more variation in results, while the 3 fitness studies at the bottom are more consistent, with their lines almost overlapping. This is because fitness is a more stable measure with less measurement error than PA. This figure shows mortality by different levels of fitness for men with and without cardiovascular disease. Participants were divided into 5 groups based on their VO2 max. Is there a difference if you're in the top 40% for exercise capacity? No, the mortality risk is very similar for the 2 highest fitness groups. Just like with PA, the most health benefits are gained by moving from the lowest to the next lowest fitness group. How does having cardiovascular disease affect this? Improving fitness from the lowest to the second lowest group yields fewer benefits if you have cardiovascular disease, but if you're in the top 40%, it doesn't matter if you have cardiovascular disease or not, the risk is similar. Now let's explore some dose-response relationships in other lifestyle behaviors and health outcomes. The first example is BMI and mortality. What kind of dose-response relationship is this? It's a typical U-shaped curve where the lowest mortality is associated with a BMI of 22.5. Being too lean is not healthy either. BMI in the 18 to 19 range is linked to higher mortality than BMI over 40. Surprisingly, the mortality risk for being underweight is higher than for being obese. What role does smoking play here? The blue line represents non-smokers, and it appears that smoking has a protective effect for individuals with a BMI over 24. Non-smokers with higher BMIs actually have higher mortality than smokers in the same BMI category. Now, let's look at sleep and mortality. This study examined over 1.1 million adults aged 30 to 102. What is the optimal amount of sleep per night? 7 hours of sleep per night was associated with the lowest mortality. Interestingly, people who sleep 8 hours per night form the largest group, followed by those who sleep 7 hours. Short sleepers may have sleep disorders, while long sleepers of 9 to 10 hours may have depression or other health issues. Finally, let's consider alcohol consumption and mortality. What is the optimal number of drinks? I'll ask you to interpret this figure in this week's online quiz.